So it took me a while, but then I realized that the errors that we were looking at were saslint errors, which is a different linter than the one we have configured for this particular project and all the SAS Playground ones, which is stylint instead of saslint. And you'll notice that now that I removed my extension, or that I disabled it, so this is the one extension that I use in other projects that I have, and you can tell now that this is disabled. And once I did that, then I got rid of all the different errors that we previously had, the ones that I quote unquote fixed here. So let's do something and go back to the way we had previously ordered these properties here, because I think they only make sense to be grouped by what they do. So for instance, we first change the height, and then all things flex related are grouped together here. And I think that still makes sense and doesn't need to be alphabetically ordered. And this is usually how I do write my CSS and my SAS code. All right, so now that we have that out of the way, let's do work a little bit on the actual checkboxes. All right, and I want to bump up the size for this a little bit. So let's do that here. And let's do 1.6 ems. Actually, there we go. And this way we will be a little bit more consistent. All right. So the next step will be to address all the inputs, which are checkboxes. And then let me open up the markup. And we'll do so on the top here. Okay. So do you remember that we mentioned we have all the checkboxes grouped, well, first in a div so that they can be separated a little bit from one another, but then also we wanted to have the input and then a label for it right after that. And we can take advantage of this, the fact that we have the label afterwards, by saying, okay, I want the input, but actually the label that goes right after it, or the sibling. That's what the plus sign would be. And let's say we want to apply a color there of tomato. This is a nice color. Okay, so we are grabbing the label, but we do not want to modify the first checkbox there. So we don't want to touch the ID of original. So that will remain the same, so that we can tell the difference between all the checkboxes against the native default one. Okay. I'm going to keep the markup up here so that we don't get lost, and we'll work on the section over here. Okay, so now we know we can target this, and there is a particular pseudo selector that we have for some inputs, such as the radio buttons, or in our case the checkboxes, which is the checked pseudo selector. And this happens when a user checks the input. And what we can do here is get a hold of the input, but what we're interested in is the label itself, because on that label we want to add a particular content or another element there, which is going to replace the input itself. So we want to have something in there, and in this case let's add an emoji here. So I'm going to use this one, and we want to have a margin there of 5 pixels just to make a little bit of room. Okay, so you can tell now that both the enabled and disabled checkboxes, which were checked, have the emoji there, which is nice. But this means that the input will need to go away. So let's change the opacity for it to be 0. And now we're talking. So now we are hiding the actual input from all of our checkboxes, but using an emoji instead to communicate that the checkbox has been checked. Let's do something similar for the unchecked state. Do you think this will work? Let's give it a shot. Let's do the emoji with no mouth there. Okay, so there's no such property as unchecked. But what we can do is, just as we did with the I don't want the original checkbox, is we want to use that not pseudo selector. And right away we can see how the emoji with no mouth is the unchecked state. And if I clicked, we can check that checkbox. All right, cool. But this code doesn't really look very dry or don't repeat yourself. What we can do is we can abstract part of it, because we know we want the icon to be 5 pixels apart from the actual label. It's just the content that is different in there. So let's refactor this a little bit and say, actually, now that we have this, we don't need that color, but we want to say that before and after we want the margin. Okay, so we can remove those from here, and you can see we get the same effect. So we didn't really change anything here. Okay, great. Lastly, we probably want to move the opacity up here because it affects the input directly. All right, and we're looking good.